everyone is talking about the Abrams, but just what are the benefits and constraints of these heavy armored tanks going into Ukraine? The Sun has a report, I guess, via Reuters. Anyway, we're going to take a look at it, and we're going to get deep into the technicals of these tanks. Let's get into it.
The announcement that the US and Germany will begin donating dozens of their main battle tanks to Ukraine's war effort after weeks of diplomatic debate and speculation is being heralded as a game changer by Kyiv. Germany says its overall goal is to send 2 tank battalions, which are typically comprised of 3 or 4 smaller units called companies, each with about 14 tanks apiece. The US on Wednesday said it would send 31 of its most advanced battle tanks, the M1 Abrams.
Getting those vehicles will improve their ability to take ground. I would be a little cautious about assuming that with them they will conquer the world.
Stephen Biddle, adjunct senior fellow.
Yeah, Stephen Biddle's actually spot on about this. When you're talking about dozens of tanks, it's just not enough to be totally decisive on their own. What I would point out is that having companies or battalions of very effective tanks combined with Ukraine's existing tank formations may improve their efforts considerably. They have a successful mechanized offensive or semi-mechanized offensive under their belt in the form of the Kharkiv offensive. So Ukraine has the troops to sustain these sort of decisive operations. Now, the actual capabilities of these tanks is worth talking about. And it's important to understand what they can and can't bring to the fight. So the Abrams is, of course, a tank with a long combat history, has been in service since 1980 with the U.S. and its allies. There's about 10,000 that have been in production. And notably, one of the things that's interesting is the Army actually, for basically the last 20 years, has said, we don't need more Abrams. And yet the production orders for Abrams have continued to pour in. So the U.S. has a lot of these and a lot are in storage. So it certainly has the tanks to spare. What's interesting as well is that this clocks in at 73 short tons in its most potent variant, the M1A2 SEP V3. Requires a crew of 4, uses composite armor, a 120 millimeter main gun with a secondary M2, M2 or a 7.62 round. What I think is really worth talking about, though, is the range of this vehicle. And it can get about 265 miles on the road. And when traveling across country, it can get about 93 to 124 miles on over open terrain. The Leopard 2, right, the main battle tank of Germany, has basically been in operation the exact same length of time. And it is a significantly less expensive tank at a per unit cost of about, looks like about 14 million. In contrast, a Abrams, which benefits a little bit from the scale. Well, actually, oh, there you go. Okay, in 2016 it was about so it was about 9 million. In 2016, which you bring it forward. So actually they're about comparable in cost. Leopard 2 a bit more expensive. But remember there's an economy of scale with the Abrams, right? It has 3 times as much in production. But when we look, we can see that the Leopard is about the same weight, 73 short tons, and also sports the same 120 millimeter cannon main gun. It has a secondary armament also of a 7.62 general purpose machine gun, and an operational range of about 210 miles on the road and about 140 miles across the country. Now, this is worth noting for a couple reasons. First, well, let's let him talk a little bit more, and then we'll talk about what it means.
Fellow for Defense Policy at the Center for Foreign Relations.
Okay, so this is an example of what I think is really emblematic. This is obviously on a training ground, but you notice how these tanks are advancing. They're advancing along these roadways, but in the event that something that they had to maneuver off the roadways, if they were being targeted with artillery or mines or something, they could easily turn and operate on this more rugged terrain here. And this looks like the terrain that they would expect to see in large parts of Ukraine. When we look at the map of Ukraine, I'll show you guys why this is so significant. Okay, so first let me pull up the correct map here. This will be the better map for this. All right, so this is the territory control map I use on my daily updates, which if you guys are interested, of course, be sure to hit subscribe. And as always, if you're interested in the combat videos coming out of this conflict that YouTube won't let me show you, I do all those breakdowns on my Patreon. They're also useful because YouTube has been cracking down, sometimes fairly arbitrarily, on videos. I would say probably now about 1 in every 5 of my videos. Even though I think it's YouTube policy compliant, YouTube just decides to demonetize. And I just shift those onto the Patreon. So check out the link in the description for that. But that's not what we're here to talk about. What we're here to talk about is the terrain. Now, here's 2 examples of terrain where I think where this sort of tank or armored operations, mechanized operations are very effective. Up here, this is territory that was recently, in September, liberated in the Kharkiv offensive. You can see it's sort of slowly loading, but let's zoom in on what it looks like. And when we zoom in, we can see that a lot of this is wooded area, but look, literally a lot of this recently liberated area is farmland. And you can see that it's open terrain with these small lines of trees. And here's roadways that are fairly predictable routes between these small towns, but on either side are huge open spaces where tanks can easily maneuver, tanks and other mechanized forces, infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, etc. So you've got these large open terrains that can be seized, and then it's just on the infantry supported by these armored vehicles to dig out Russian forces in these villages, right, to ensure that these roadways are clear, allowing the tank formations to pass and continue moving along. But you can see how that with armored vehicles, you can really gain a ton of maneuverability. And that's the sort of terrain where Ukrainian forces want to seek out in this conflict that's what they want to try to liberate, given that they have this advantage and a growing advantage in armored and maneuver warfare. So you can see here, you've got the same thing. You've got open terrain, right, interspersed between these wooded and river areas where Ukrainian forces should be able to push Russians out of these villages, again, supported by these tanks, and move from sort of hopscotch across this big open terrain where it's very hard to stop tanks in open terrain. They can be very, very decisive, especially if those tanks are supported by infantry forces. Now, where should tanks not go? Here's a good example. Let's say that instead they said, let's liberate Donetsk city. Well, imagine you're a tank. You have these main guns have a range of like 3,000 meters or more, but they can really deliver accurate fire. Well, look, you can see here on the scale, this is 500 feet. So if you're a tank, and let's say you are anywhere in one of these cities, right? You can basically, if you're sitting here on this street, you can get about maybe 2,000 meters just down the road. If your target is slightly off the road, if they're literally your target is on the sidewalk, you can't find them. You see how instead of having this big 360-degree field of view like you would have on open terrain, they're constrained into these narrow roads where they can only see the enemy in these really narrow positions. If the enemy is, let's say, in a building right here, right, how's the tank going to engage that target if it's up here or up here? It may not be possible. The tank may not have line of sight. And so you see how taking tanks into urban environments, let's say you were right here, you notice this curve means that it's going to be hard. If a tank is here, it can only see just a few dozen feet before the road bends away and it can no longer engage targets. So you see how not only will these tanks be unable to bring their full effectiveness, because their effectiveness comes from standoff distance, it comes from speed, it comes from armor, and it comes from firepower, right? That's the four things that the tank brings to the battlefield that cannot be substituted. And when you're in an urban area, yes, the armor remains valuable, the firepower remains sort of valuable, but it loses its standoff distance and it loses its speed. You just can't haul through these streets. It's just not going to be a working method. The U.S. sort of did it in their so-called thunder runs through Baghdad, but that was a very different environment where the U.S. owned the air. And so it meant that those tanks were always supported by continuous aircraft. It's a different animal in Ukraine where nobody really controls the airspace. Okay.
And Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University.
M1 Abrams is widely regarded as the single best main battle tank in the world today. It's been around for a long time, but it's been upgraded repeatedly over the years, and it has performed in combat against Soviet and Russian-made tanks very effectively. There's every reason to believe.
This is true. We may think, oh, there hasn't been a tank battle, but when we look, remember, the U.S. has obviously fought in the Gulf War with the Abrams. In the initial invasion of the war in Afghanistan, there was some use of these tanks. In the initial invasion of the Iraq War, the Abrams was very frequently used. The Iraqi army had almost entirely Soviet-made tanks. In the war in Iraq shows up again as the fighting in ISIL, fighting against ISIS, in which the Iraqi government fought ISIS. And that war, think of it as the Iraqi Civil War. And that, of course, Iraqi forces used their Abrams tanks. And, of course, the Saudi Arabian-led intervention in Yemen, which is, wow, that's a real euphemism for a war. The Saudi Arabian, it's really the Yemeni civil war. But it's Saudi-backed, and so that means the Abrams is also supporting Saudi-backed forces in that conflict. So as you guys can see, it has a fairly robust combat record. The Leopard, a bit less so. Let's see. It was somewhat used in the war in Afghanistan and was provided to some factions in the Syrian civil war. Maybe the Turks use it, but it has less of a combat record. It's a little more of an unknown, but it's hard to understate that this is a tank that has been proven time and time again as a combat effective main battle tank. And important, used by forces that are not like the U.S. And we'll talk about this a little later in the video, so I'll hold off.
I believe that it is a dramatically superior vehicle to the one the Russians are now fielding and to the ones that the Ukrainians are now fielding.
While Kyiv has praised the decision, Biddle doesn't expect the latest promised weapons to change the tide of the war.
The numbers that the Americans are talking about are not going to be militarily significant in and of themselves. Right? A couple of dozen tanks are not going to reverse the battlefield outcome in Ukraine. Hundreds are going to be needed. Now, the Leopard 2s can be provided in those kinds of numbers, in part because lots of different European countries operate them.
The Leopard 2s are...
Yes, this is part of it. You may notice that, again, the number Kiev put out was about 300. They want to see about 300 of these Leopard 2 tanks, or about 300 of these top-tier main battle tanks. But you realize the U.S. has agreed to contribute about 10% of them right now, and all of the Ukrainian allies combined probably are looking at about, I'd say it sounds like maybe 50 to 100. This is significant, right, for a couple of reasons. First off, you've got to understand that this effort is a starting point, and a couple of things have to happen. Two major problems have to be solved by the Ukrainian military before these things can be brought to the battlefield. The first is crews. You have to be able to crew this new weapon system. And when I say crew, I don't mean just the 4-man team, 4-soldier team that operates these tanks. You also have, of course, the supporting, right? You need to have a tank mechanic. You need to have a tank logistics train, and those require troops to understand the needs of these vehicles and to understand how they operate. You also have a second problem, that is logistics itself, getting parts. Remember, the Abrams is made in the United States, so parts need to go from the United States to Ukraine. Now, we have a lot of spare parts stationed throughout Europe, etc. And you can start to draw on those as easier sort of logistics chains. But it's a tough problem to solve when you're talking about a bunch of specialty parts. And remember, tanks are big mechanical monsters that really get run hard by definition. And so the breakdowns, damaged parts, worn out parts, they need to be replaced on a regular basis. Not to say nothing of tanks damaged but not destroyed in combat. So you have this logistics problem you have to solve, and it's hard to solve it for 300 tanks. So what you want to do is start to scale it. What these tank crews, they get trained on the Abrams now, are probably going to do, they will probably become the trainers of future Abrams crews, right? They'll get several weeks of instruction from the United States, right? They'll get put through several exercises, and then they will be expected to train Ukrainian troops in using the Abrams. And then when you have a large cadre of trained crew who are experienced, and you have the logistics tail to support it. Again, having these tanks operate in a training environment is going to give you a chance to train your logistics systems, right? Those tanks will break down on a training field just as much as almost as much as they'll break down in combat. So it gives you a chance to improve your ability to get supply, get the orders, understand how the fuel storage will need to work. And it'll give Ukraine a chance to crawl before it has to walk, in terms of maintaining, going from maintaining 30 tanks to maintaining 300, similar to the Leopard 2s, right? You want to start by having them maintain crew and field, a dozen, 2, 3, 4 dozen, and then you can scale it up very quickly. So that's a good way to think about this initial batch as being like the first dose of a medicine, right? Oftentimes we build up to the point where we are, getting the full effect. That's not a good analogy, I understand, but that's the only one I can think of at the moment. But you understand what I mean, a gradual introduction. Think of them as think of it better like working out, right? You aren't going to step into the gym and start pulling 600-pound deadlifts, right? You may not even step into the gym and do a full workout. You may simply go and learn each exercise in turn before you go ahead and go and run through the workout routine with lots and lots of weight. That's what we're doing here.
What Germany plans to supply to Ukraine. However, Biddle says the US held back providing Ukraine with the M1 Abrams, initially out of the concern the Ukrainians wouldn't be able to handle the tank's complex logistical needs. There's also another catch. The Biden administration says the Abrams is meant for Ukraine's long-term defense, and it will take months, not weeks, to arrive. That means they likely won't be part of any expected spring offensives to break the deadlock in eastern Ukraine, where German intelligence believes Kyiv's forces are taking casualties in the triple digits every day.
Yeah, so also worth noting, okay. Yes, they are probably taking triple-digit casualties, though the question is not, are they taking too many casualties as a whole number? Are they taking too many casualties relative to Russian forces? And this is sort of the question on everyone's mind. We believe some data, it's not clear how verifiable it is, but some data indicates that of the 50,000 prisoners recruited from penal colonies to serve in the Wagner Group, only about less than 100 remain and are either deserted, WIA, KIA, or simply MIA, have simply gone missing on the battlefield. This is, of course, a completely logical response to the way these troops are used, or more like abused. But it's tough to know what is and is not a sustainable loss rate for the Ukrainian forces. And as we've seen, I sort of suspect that Ukraine is as preparing for this spring offensive by actually reducing its troop commitments to the front lines and trading space for time against Russia, where it's allowing Russia to move forward, sort of crawl forward, in exchange for the fact that their troops are pulling back in an organized way to preserve their combat power for hopefully a larger spring offensive. Anyway, guys, that's all I had for you. As always, if you want to support the channel, check out the Patreon. Thanks so much to my Lieutenant tier patrons. You guys are the ones who make this whole thing possible, and I will see you guys in the next one.